Hello, and welcome to this final lesson in our series based on the Old Testament book of Esther. Our series is entitled God in the Shadows, and the lesson for this scripture for this lesson is taken from chapters 9 and 10. As we said from the beginning, the book of Esther is one of two books in the Old Testament that does not mention God by name. Yahweh, the God of Israel, is not mentioned by name anywhere. But as we have noticed throughout these several lessons, God's fingerprints are all over the incidents that occur. It is very clear that God is working in the shadows through all of these circumstances in the life of not only two individuals, Esther and Mordecai, but also in the life of his people, the Jewish exiles living in the Persian kingdom during post the Babylonian capture. We come today to this lesson at the very end of the book. We've already been through the whole series of events of the queen being removed and Esther being chosen as the queen, and then Mordecai, her uncle, having offended Haman, the number two man in the kingdom, and Mordecai plotting to destroy all the Jews and having the order entered that all the Jews throughout the Persian Empire, that vast empire from Ethiopia all the way to India, that all the Jews should be killed on the 13th day of the 12th month. And of course then we looked at the incident where Esther very bravely goes to the king and asks him, well, first of all, she asked him to come to a banquet. He comes to a banquet, and then at that banquet, she said, well, come to another banquet tomorrow and bring Haman. Haman was there, and we saw the incident where Haman, at the banquet, watches as Esther tells the king that all of her people are going to be killed because of this order. And the king asks who would do such a thing, and she points to Haman. And then the king is very mad and he leaves, and we remember that Haman, realizing that he was that his days were numbered because the king was very favorable toward Esther and toward Mordecai, because Mordecai had remember Mordecai had saved him from an assassination plot. Haman realized that he was in grave danger, began to plead with Esther for his life. When the king came back into the room, Haman just at that moment falls on her couch. The king assumes that Haman is trying to molest the queen, and he orders that he be executed. And he is. He's executed, and he's actually hung on the pole that was constructed outside his house where he had intended to hang Mordecai's body if he had been able to get Mordecai executed as he planned. And we saw that, in fact, the king gave Esther Haman's fortunes, his estate, and then Esther named Mordecai as the administrator. And then in the last lesson, we saw Esther and Mordecai come back to the king and ask him to reverse the order that had been previously entered. And the king told him that he couldn't do that, but he gave Mordecai his signet ring, which means he made him the number two man in the kingdom. And he said, you write an order as you please. And Mordecai and Esther prepared an order and had it sent out. And it was sent throughout the entire kingdom, all 127 provinces. It was translated into every language so that everyone would read it. And what the order said was that the Jews were allowed to assemble. Now, the king could not reverse or rescind the order that had been previously issued. And the previous order said, on the 13th day of the 12th month, kill all the Jews. Well, the order that Haman and Esther wrote said, under the authority of the king, said the Jews can defend themselves. They can assemble, they can prepare themselves, and they can defend themselves. And if in fact the people of the kingdom were to attack them, they not only can kill the ones who are attacking them, but they can also annihilate their families women, and children, and also take their possessions. In other words, the exact same terms of the first order were now included in the second order, but it was against the enemies of the Jews should they attack. And now, again, this wasn't a reversal of the initial order, but it was to give the Jews the opportunity to defend themselves. Okay? So the king has set this, has allowed Mordecai to write this order, and this has gone out with the king's authority. That brings us to chapter 9. Now remember, the second order, the order that Mordecai and Esther wrote, that was written during the third month. The actual execution day was not to be until the 13th day of the 12th month. So there was lots of time in there for this edict to be distributed and for the Jews to prepare and plan for themselves. So we get to chapter 9, we now are going to look at what happened on the day that the first order was to be carried out. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. That is, kill all the Jews. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. That was the original plan. That was Haman's plan all along. He was such a bitter enemy, and there were people who were so bitterly opposed to the Jewish people that they wanted to destroy them. But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. Now the king's order says, yeah, you can kill the Jews, but the Jews have the right to defend themselves and kill the enemies of the Jews and take their property. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those seeking their destruction. Okay? So they assemble, they get ready, they're all set should someone attack them. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. Now, we need to understand that what's happened during this period of time, the word has gotten out. The king now is favoring the Jews. The king now is allowing not only the Jews to defend themselves, the king has made one of them, Mordecai, his number 2 man in the country, and everybody identifies that the queen is actually a Jew. So the other nationalities realize that there is support for the Jews at King Xerxes' palace and throughout the royal officialdom. So therefore, they become afraid to take a side in this struggle between the enemies of the Jews and the Jews. It says, because all the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them, and all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews, because fear of Mordecai had seized them. He has grown in such stature, they realized that they did not want to offend the number 2 man in the kingdom, so now they're helping the Jews. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. And we're going to see a reference to that again later in the lesson. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. So there were still people who were going to attack the Jews. There are still people who were enabled or emboldened by that first order, and they thought this was their chance to take out their revenge on their enemies from the centuries before. But as they did, the Jews responded and attacked them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. So in the capital city there where Esther and Mordecai lived, where the palace was, the official administrative capital, the Jews killed some 500 who had gathered together to attack the Jews. They also killed, and then it gives a list of names. And what we have here is a list of 10 names referring to the 10 sons of Haman, who is known as the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Despite the fact that the second order gave the Jews the right to take the plunder, take the property of the people they killed. The Jews did not do that. In fact, that's such a significant fact that it's mentioned 3 times in this chapter. They did not take the property of the people they killed, but they did kill those who had designs on attacking them. The number of those slain in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king that same day. Now we're talking about the 13th day of the 12th month. And the king learns that there's been 500 killed in the capital city by the Jews defending themselves. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces?" In other words, he had gotten the message about the 500 in Susa, that city, and Haman's 10 sons. Now he's asking, what about the other provinces around? Now what have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? It will also be granted. He said, I wonder how it's going outside in those remote areas, because there are Jews scattered throughout the kingdom. I wonder how many have been killed out there. And he says, now that you have had your opportunity to defend yourself, now that your second order is being carried out, what's your request? And Esther, having learned before the way to approach the king, she starts off with, if it pleases the king. Remember, her psychology all along has been, this is not about me. This is not about my people. This is about you, king. Putting the emphasis on him. If it pleases the king, Esther answered, give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this edict tomorrow. Also, let Haman's 10 sons be hung or hanged on gallows. So what she's saying is that 500 have been killed on the 13th day. But there's still some tension. There's still some unfinished business. At least for the city of Susa, let your order be binding on the 14th day as well. And then she also said, and take the sons of Haman, the 10 sons of Haman that have been killed, and hang their bodies. And the term that's used here is gallows. We understood this from when he was building the gallows to hang Mordecai on, that this was probably a tall pole that's built out in public. And what they would do is they would kill someone, execute them, and then they would hang their body, impale their body on this pole to hang out there in public so that everyone could see, and it would be the ultimate disgrace, the ultimate shame, not only of having been executed, but now being disgraced by being hung on the gallows. So her request was, give us another day to finish the business and hang the bodies of the 10 sons of Haman on the gallows, just like their dad was hung on the gallows. Remember, the gallows had been built for Mordecai, but when Haman was executed, they hung his body on there. Now she's saying, let's, these months later, now this is like 9 months later, she said, let these sons also be hung on the gallows to be disgraced. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they hanged the 10 sons on Haman. The edict being issued in Susa would say the Jews have the right on the 14th day to also kill their enemies. The Jews in Susa came together, and on the 14th day of the month of Adar, they put to death in Susa 300 men. 500 were killed on the 13th day. 300 men are killed on the 14th day. But they did not lay hands on their plunder. Again, they didn't follow through with what they could have done. They simply killed their enemies. So you've got 800 that have been killed in the city of Susa. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who are in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. So what we've got is, throughout the kingdom, outside of Susa, the report is there are 75,000 that were killed. Now, some commentators suggest that this may be an exaggeration. it's interesting that when the Jewish scholars in Alexandria translated the Old Testament into Greek, in that version that we call the Septuagint, the number that they use here is 15,000. And many commentators believe that's probably a more accurate number. If there were only 800 killed in Susa, it seems like there wouldn't be that many killed elsewhere. But anyway, bottom line is a large number were killed. But the point is, in Susa, the killing was done over 2 days. In the rest of the kingdom, it all happened in 1 day, the 13th day of the 12th month. And then the Jews rested because there was great feast. It made it a day of feasting and joy. On the 14th day in the rest of the empire, they weren't killing anybody. They were feasting and celebrating because God had delivered them. Let's look at verse 18. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made a day of feasting and joy. So both the 13th and the 14th were days that they were killing people. Then on the 15th day, they had a time of feasting and celebration because they had been relieved from the threat of their enemies. That is why rural Jews living in villages observe the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Now, I need to come back and give a little bit of perspective here. The book of Esther was probably written by someone, obviously after the fact. It was written by someone who was known. Now, some suggest that it wasn't written for hundreds of years. The argument that seems to be very persuasive that couldn't be true is the fact that all 10 of those Persian names of the Haman's sons were listed, and someone 300 years later would not have remembered those names, and those were all Persian names. So, but this was probably written some point in time, not too long after these incidents had occurred. Not while they are occurring, but written as history after they've occurred. And so he makes the comment that the reason that the Jews in the rural areas were celebrating the relief on an annual basis on the 14th day, but the Jews elsewhere were celebrating the 14th and the 15th, is because some of them started their feasting and their celebration on the 14th because they only had the issue or the benefit of the order on the 13th. But the Jews in Susa had the benefit of Mordecai's order on the 13th and the 14th, and their feasting and celebrations were not until the 15th. Mordecai, now we're going to get, this is where the lesson actually starts. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as a month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote to them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So now, Mordecai, the number 2 man in the kingdom, he sends out a letter. Now notice that this is not an order. This is not an edict from the king, but he is someone of significant authority. He's obviously significant civil authority because he's the number 2 man to the king. He has the king's signet ring. But he's also very important amongst the Jews because he has been the forefront, he has been at the forefront of seeing that the Jews have been saved, have been spared. He has been used by God to deliver the Jews. So he sends out these letters and he says, here's what we need to do. Here's what we need to do. Every year we need to celebrate on the 14th and 15th days of Adar, the 12th month, celebrate the fact that God delivered us. Now, this was not being established by God through the prophecy or the words of Moses, as was Passover. This was not being established by God, such as the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Pentecost, those feasts that were designated in the law of Moses. This was being established by a civilian. This was a ceremony. And remember now, let's think about it. The Jews living in the Persian Empire would have had great reason to celebrate and to feast. But remember, not all the Jews were living in the Persian Empire. A significant number, a good number, of the Jews who had been taken into exile had already returned to Jerusalem. By the time of Esther's story, the temple has already been rebuilt. There are already people living over there. And now here is Mordecai, a civilian, not a priest, not speaking for God, but a civilian saying, we ought to, as a people, celebrate this annual festival. And the people in Jerusalem could have said, why would we do that? Why would we do that? Well, let's keep on. So he's saying to the people who are living throughout the Persian Empire, every year we ought to celebrate on the 14th and 15th days because God has delivered us. Now, Passover was a celebration instituted by God to celebrate the deliverance of God's people from Egypt. Now they have been delivered from extinction doesn't say by God, but we see God's fingerprints all over this. And now there is another day of celebration that's called for. So Mordecai sends this letter suggesting this. Then he says, Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the province of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the times when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrows were turned into joy, and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days, and listen what he suggested they do as observance. Fast feasting, times of joy and celebration, giving presents of food to one another, and giving of gifts to the poor. Now this is more than simply patting ourselves on the back because we've been delivered, we've delivered ourselves. This is celebrating the goodness of God, and part of that celebration is by sharing with the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. They accepted this, even though it wasn't established through the prophet of God. They accepted this, and they began, and by the time the author of Esther is writing this, there has probably been 1, 2, or more celebrations of this time, celebrating this deliverance that has come through the faithful commitment of Esther and Mordecai. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and had cast the pur. Now remember in the very early lessons when we talked about Haman's plot, evidently he got a group together because it says they cast pur. Pur was a Persian word that refers to lots. We would talk about in casting lots about like rolling the dice or drawing a short straw or something like that. It was a means of chance by which they chose the day that their order should be carried out. Now, it was in the first month of the year that they had this order written, and by casting lots, by chance, they had selected the 13th day of the 12th month. But they had cast pur. They had cast lots to determine what day this should happen. Now, there's one of those fingerprints of God. Because remember, that was some 11 months away. Esther and Mordecai's order was written in the 3rd month. That's still some 8 or 9 months away. So there was time for the Jews to prepare themselves based upon the circumstances and the having cast pur and that date having been set so late in the year. And so So they cast lots for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued an orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back on his own head, and that his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Isn't it interesting? We're having a little a recount of what's happened so far, and the author points out, Haman had intended to have Mordecai hung on that post. Yet Haman is executed and his body is hung up there. Haman had intended to have all the Jews killed. Yet not only were the Jews not killed, rather the enemies of the Jews were killed, and Haman's own sons were killed and hung on the gallows, hung on the post. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur. So the author is explaining why the Feast of Purim is called the Feast of Purim. Now, just to remind us, the Feast of Purim is still being observed today by faithful Jews. It's still being observed. And one of the ways they observe it is they read the book of Esther every year. Okay? So he's explaining why the Feast of Purim is called the Feast of Purim. And the reason it's called the Feast of Purim, because Haman cast lots for the date, and on the date that was meant to be the destruction of the people of Judah, in fact, it was the destruction of the enemies of Judah. God delivered his people, and this is the day they would celebrate. Because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them, the Jews took it upon themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who would join them should, without fail, observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. So there is clearly established this time of celebration, the Feast of Purim, to celebrate God's deliverance of his people from this ordered annihilation. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation and by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never cease to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of them die out among their descendants. So this was understood to be a celebration that was going to be followed down through the centuries. Not only to the Jews that were living there in Susha, the Jews living in the Persian Empire, but Jews everywhere, and not just those who were alive then. This is to be observed by their descendants, by their children. Now, Mordecai has sent out this letter suggesting that they establish this feast. And in fact, we're told by the author, in response to that letter, they did begin to do the feasting, and they established the feast. But that wasn't the end of it. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abigail, now by that reference, we're pointing out her Jewish lineage. We're pointing out that she too was a Jew. We're pointing out the vulnerability that she had. Even though she was queen, she was subject to that order as well. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abigail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter concerning Purim. So what happens is they send out another letter. And this letter doesn't suggest, as the first one does, this one more or less gives an order. This confirms. This says, this practice is good and this is what you ought to do. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in 127 provinces of the kingdom of Xerxes with words of goodwill and assurance to establish the days of Purim at their designated times as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regards to the times of fasting and lamentation. Now, they sent out this second letter, and this is confirming. This is saying what we suggested and now you're doing, since you are doing it so well, since you have accepted it, we want to establish this and make it more binding. Now, what authority would they have? Well, Mordecai was the number 2 man in the kingdom. He had authority. Esther was the queen. More importantly, they were Jewish, and the Jews looked to them as being their leaders. So now we have a second letter written that's saying this is what we ought to do. But notice in this particular letter, they expand the means of celebration. The first letter talked about feasting, and it talked about giving gifts of food, and talked about giving to the poor. This one adds two other factors. One, it said fasting, a time of fasting. It said to establish the days of Purim as designated time, as Mordecai the Jew and Esther had decreed for them, and they had established for themselves in regard to the descendants, in regard to the times of fasting and lamentation. Fasting and lamentation. Remember the importance of fasting. When Mordecai asked Esther to go to the king and seek relief from Haman's initial order, and Esther was somewhat reluctant out of fear, she then told Mordecai to have all the Jews in Susa to fast for 3 days. And she and her staff would fast for 3 days. And it was after the fasting that she then went to the king. And of course the king then said, "What would you have?" And that started the whole series of events. Fasting played an important role. And so they're suggesting that at this time of celebration, they should have a fast. And this is known as the Fast of Esther. Also a time of lamentation. Now the first letter emphasized the joy, turning mourning into joy, turning bitterness into happiness. It's talking about a time of celebrating. They're saying, but we also ought to remember the grief our people experienced. We also ought to remember the bad time, the feeling that we had when it looked like we were going to be annihilated. We need to remember the grief. And then we can celebrate the relief that came and the joy. We can turn mourning into celebration because we understand God has intervened for us. So they give these instructions, and then the author tells us Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. What records are we talking about? It seems that this is a reference back to the same records that the story of Mordecai had been written in. Remember when Mordecai reported the event or the assassination attempt, it was recorded in the official records of the kingdom. And then when the king couldn't go to sleep that night, they read to him from the official records, and that's when they read the story of Mordecai to him and reminded him of Mordecai. This seems to be the official records. Now that Esther is queen and Mordecai is the number 2 man, the prime minister, they would have some influence over what should be included. And so in the official records, it is written that, in fact, they were to celebrate Purim in honor of the deliverance from the annihilation planned by Haman. Okay, this is a time of celebration. This was to be a time of remembrance. And just as the Jews were very faithful, just as the children of Israel were faithful, or many of them were faithful throughout the centuries to remember the Passover, God delivered them from Egypt. Now they were to remember that they had been spared from annihilation because of God working through these 2 faithful people of Mordecai and Esther. Well, let's turn to verse chapter 10. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire and to the distant shores. Now that sounds like a strange thing to put in there. Chapter 10 is the conclusion of the book that the author basically kind of adds on. Now remember, in the original there were no chapter designations or verse designations, so this should just be the last few lines, but it's subject to being a separate chapter because it changes topics completely. And the whole emphasis of chapter 10 is on the power or the authority or the prominence of Mordecai. Now the book is Esther. The book is about Esther. But Mordecai played a significant role. The one way to emphasize the prominence or the preeminence of Mordecai is to first start talking about King Xerxes. Now, we've already been told that King Xerxes was the ruler over an empire, 127 provinces that stretched from Ethiopia in Central Africa all the way east to India. A lot of land. This statement here about he imposed tribute throughout the empire to the distant shores, this doesn't say much to us, but to the reader of that day and time, it would say a lot. For you see, the only one who could impose tribute is the one who was the absolute ruler. If people in a distant land didn't have absolute loyalty, they wouldn't pay taxes all the way back to Susha, back to Persia. They'd say, you want them? Come get them. But Xerxes had such authority and such power throughout that empire. He imposed tribute, and they paid. All of his acts of power and might, together with the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king had raised him, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Okay, here's this book again. In the book, the chronicles of the events of this kingdom, Xerxes' authority and power is written, is confirmed, is explained. And as you see his power and authority, you see him now naming as his number 2 man, Mordecai. That only elevates the status of Mordecai. You elevate the status of Mordecai by first of all saying the man that honored him had extreme power and had the authority to do so. So he starts off talking about the power, the authority, the might of King Xerxes. And then he says, now this same King Xerxes has elevated Mordecai. And it's all written down in the books. Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all Jews. In other words, Mordecai is to be given credit as well as Esther, because he spoke up for the Jews. He was concerned about the well-being of the Jews. Remember, he came to Esther and said, you need to go to the king. And when she was reluctant, he said to her, maybe you will become queen for just such a time as this. And that's when he convinced her that she should go. So the book concludes with this emphasis on the role of Mordecai. Let me read to you one summary of all of these things that we've been reading about. I've been talking about here. It's a rather lengthy summary, but I think it gives us an overview of what these chapters are saying. It says, the universal adoption of Purim feast by the Jewish nation. Now, by universal adoption, I'm talking about the people in the Babylonian Empire, the people in the Persian Empire, the people living back in Jerusalem, the people scattered all over the world. They all followed this feast, even though it was not established as a religious feast. It was all followed. It says it was followed. It was never a very important part of the nation, but it is a curious fact, and it's certainly not satisfactorily accounted for by the beauty of the book of Esther. In other words, it wasn't just the fact that Esther's a nice book that caused all the people to adopt this feast as Mordecai suggested. Mordecai had no ecclesiastical authority, and it might have been expected that the Jews of Jerusalem would have demurred, that is, refused, the imposition of a fresh religious obligation upon them by the Jews of dispersion, who was neither a prophet, nor a priest, nor even a Levite. He didn't have any of that authority to impose a feast. The Jews of Jerusalem, in their strongly situated city, which was wholly theirs, and with their temple fortress complete, remember they've already completed the temple, rebuilding the temple, which was to have begun and ended in a day. But Jehoiakim, the high priest of the time, to whom we have seen an introduction and seen it in other scriptures, the book of Esther was attributed by some, to whom the book of Esther is attributed by some. Some suggest that Jehoiakim, who was the high priest back in Jerusalem during this time, that he's the one that wrote the book of Esther. That's one tradition. He says, must have given his approval to the feast from the first. So the high priest back in Jerusalem must have given his approval to this feast and have adopted it into the ceremonies of the nation, or it would scarcely have become universal. One writer makes the argument in favor of the church's power to prescribe festival days. It must certainly have been by ecclesiastical and not by civil command that it became obligatory. So the fact that the Jews adopted this probably is related to the fact that Jehoiakim, the high priest, adopted it as Mordecai had suggested. That these days should not fail, nor the memorial of them perish. That was the statement that was made in abiding. If Jehoiakim especially is the author of the book of Esther, and he writes that the Jews should follow this down through the many generations so that these days would not be forgotten, this would give it an ecclesiastical basis. As the commemoration of human and not divine appointment, the Feast of Purim was liable to the abrogation or discontinuance. It would have been easy for the people to say, well, God didn't impose this, so we don't have to do it. The Jews of the time resolved that the observance should be perpetual, and in point of fact, the feast has continued up to the present date and is likely to continue, though they could not bind their successors. Though Mordecai and them could not bind, they suggested, and the people down through the centuries have celebrated, had followed this celebration. This gives us some indication as to the significance of Mordecai. This gives us an indication why chapter 10, especially if Jehoiakim is the one that wrote chapter 10, he is trying to elevate the status of Mordecai and establish Purim as an official feast to be celebrated by the Jews down through the centuries. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of the book. That brings us to the end of the story. But what we are learning from this lesson is that we need to stop and remember. Now, we stop as a church, we stop and remember through the liturgical calendar. We celebrate Advent and Christmas. We celebrate Good Friday. We celebrate Easter. We celebrate Pentecost. We celebrate through the church. But you know, in civil authorities, under civil authority, we stop and remember. We celebrate Thanksgiving. We celebrate 4th of July. We celebrate Memorial Day and Veterans Day. In other words, in our humanness, as well as in our spiritual side, there's something of value for us to stop and remember and observe. Especially those who have experienced the mercy of God. Especially those who have seen God's hand at work. We stop and we remember what happened in Esther's day to see God's hand delivering these people from annihilation. We stop and remember on Passover the fact that God delivered the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt. But in our personal lives, we need to stop and remember as we look back and see what God has done for us. As we stop and remember and celebrate. And how do we celebrate? Fasting. We can remember the bad times, but we also remember the good times. Sharing, giving, this is all part of the celebration that we are instructed to perform, to be involved in, as we stop and remember the mercy of God. God delivers his people. Message from Esther. But God uses committed, faithful followers to deliver his people, Esther and Mordecai. God works in mysterious ways, in the shadows, if you will, to deliver his people. And as we look back through our lives, we can see again and again how he has worked circumstances and things just in order to bring us to that point of blessing and that point of his will. But it all goes back to that commitment and that faithfulness. He is faithful to deliver his people. May we ever be faithful as his people, obedient and open. And as we see his hand at work in the shadows, may we stop and remember and celebrate the mercy of God. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for the many times you have intervened in our lives. Thank you for working in ways that we could not have expected or could not have planned. Thank you for your Holy Spirit who equips us and enables us that we might be obedient servants. And we pray now that even this week you would help us and use us. May we be instruments of your deliverance to those who are living in exile. May we be all that you've called us to be. Your faithfulness assures us that you stand ready to do for us and through us your will if we are but open. And so our prayer today, as you've taught us to pray, thy kingdom come, thy will be done. In the name of the one who taught us that prayer, even Jesus the Christ, that we pray. Amen. Thank you.